We're 3 weeks into the fantasy season and we're already starting guys that weren't even on rosters in week one. Can you really start Rashid Shaheed over Michael Pittman? Who are the best deep starts this week? We'll cover all that and more on the Fantasy First Down. It's only week 3 and the injuries are already piling up. How's your team going so far this season? Today, we're going to get into some starts and sits. I'm going to take you through my rankings for every single position, talk to you about who you should be starting and why. Plus, I'll answer all your questions in the comments. Or, if you like, you can follow me on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, where I answer all your DMs over there. On Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. Plus, it'd be great if you like and subscribe on YouTube as well. My rankings are up at ffdfantasyfootball.com, and they will keep changing up until Sunday morning. Plus, you can check out my articles over at football.rasball.com. But today, we are talking start sits for week 3. And as per usual, I'll be taking you through my rankings. Through 2 weeks of the season, I'm top 5 in accuracy on Fantasy Pros. Of course, 2 years ago, I finished 3rd overall for the season in accuracy. That's across the world, not just in my little pocket of Australia. And last season, I finished 7th overall. So hoping to do another top 10 finish, hopefully even better this season. Let's get into the quarterback rankings. And for me, you're starting your studs. Obviously, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts. If you got them on your team, you don't need another quarterback. They are the guy that you can ride all season. Frankly, for me, even if you've got someone like Kyler Murray, you realistically don't need anyone on your bench either. Kyler has shown that he's going to be very good this season. Plus, he gets a fantastic matchup against Detroit. Where this gets really interesting is Joe Burrow, who for me hasn't even been a start to this point this season. I don't think I've ranked him inside the top 15 yet, but he gets T. Higgins back. He's looking healthier, and they're facing Washington. Washington are a fantastic matchup. They have been a fantastic matchup for years. They've conceded the most fantasy points against quarterbacks this season. Last season, it was the second most, averaging 23.9 fantasy points, and that's in 4-point passing touchdown leagues per game. Expect Joe Burrow to go off, and they really need him to. They need this offense to get going. On the other hand, a couple of guys falling down because of their tough matchups. Patrick Mahomes against Atlanta. We saw Jalen Hurts struggle in the air against them, but he got it done on the ground. That's not going to be the case with Patrick Mahomes. So he gets a tougher matchup. Same thing with Anthony Richardson against the Bears and CJ Stroud against the Vikings. Now, you still got to start those guys, and those are not terrible matchups. They're just tough enough that I think you just got to realize that maybe there's guys that you like Burrow that you could start over them. Jaden Daniels also gets a relatively tough matchup against the Bengals. They've been solid so far. They also haven't exactly played against the best quarterbacks, and that could make a difference. I say that last week, obviously, but their secondary's improved a lot. I do think that Jaden Daniels will still get it done on the ground, but I do think the Bengals are a tougher matchup than usual. Jared Goff is the surprise name in the top 10. I've had him ranked pretty high the last 2 weeks, and he has not been particularly good. But they're taking on the Cardinals. The Cardinals have really surprised me this year. Traditionally, you've gotten it done on the ground against the Cardinals. I believe it was last year. Let me check this before I actually say it. Last year, they conceded the most points to running backs across the league. This season, 23rd, which is firstly a good reason why you should never look at matchups when you're deciding who to draft. And secondly, an important reason why you should let us do full analysis and look at last year, this year, what's changed, and why it's changing. Because I do think that the Cardinals are going to continue to be better against the run. That's really going to help Jared Goff this week, as I think this could be a relatively high-scoring encounter. Now, lower down, we've also got Brock Purdy. Now, this is a tough one, and I have really tossed up moving him down. And with George Kittle, I think I probably will. With just Brandon Ayuk and then it is really hard to see him having a good game, but we just see in these situations where there's good matchups, sometimes quarterbacks just seem to find a way to get it done. And I think that is very possible here, but it's also entirely possible that we'll probably see some sort of Jordan Mason getting heavily involved situation, and that would be bad for Purdy. So I think ultimately before Sunday, I'll move Purdy down, maybe even as low as 15. But I just want to see what's going to happen and how things are going to settle and what it seems like they're going to do. Now, Baker Mayfield has been good the last couple of weeks. He gets the Broncos. You don't really need to throw on the Broncos, but I think he probably will anyway. Dak Prescott against Baltimore, who's massively improved as a matchup this season. They've been a lot easier to pass on, but Still don't feel overly confident. And then there's guys like Derek Carr and Sam Darnold who are streaming options this week. Carr gets Philly, who it's easier to run on now. Previously, it's been very difficult to run on the Eagles. Last season, they were a bottom 10 running matchup, but they were the best matchup for opposing quarterbacks. This season, that's changed. They're more stable across the board. You can attack them through the air and on the ground, and we've seen that happen with a number of teams already this season. Derek Carr, I suspect, is not going to throw 3 or 4 touchdowns every week. I think we're probably going to see a lot more of Kamara in this game. That's a little bit of a hint of what's coming up later. And Sam Darnold takes on Houston. Feel like that could be a little bit of a shootout. It is a little bit tough to start him with no Jordan Addison, but I still think he could have a good game. Other guys are a bit higher than you'd usually see them. Gardner Minshew's higher against Carolina. You don't really need to pass against Carolina, but most quarterbacks still manage to get a couple of touchdowns because you're scoring so many points. Some of them are going to come in the air. Meanwhile, Bo Nix against Tampa Bay. That's a good matchup, but not as good as it has been in the past. It is hard to see him being someone you'd want to start. The guys that you might consider starting most weeks and probably shouldn't be this week, Trevor Lawrence has been struggling in general, and now he takes on the Bills, who've been excellent this season. They've conceded very few points out wide. You've had to use your tight ends, and Trevor Lawrence doesn't have Evan Ingram. Kirk Cousins, on the other hand, takes on the Chiefs. We saw the Falcons get a surprise win last week. The Chiefs are the second best quarterback matchup so far this season. There's obviously a lot of noise in the current season data, which is why I usually go back to last season, where you'll find that the Chiefs were, in fact, a bottom 6 quarterback matchup. So you can't really feel particularly good about that. I feel like that realistically, the Chiefs are actually a very good defense, and it's going to be hard for Kirk Cousins this week. If anything, I think he might get it done by Kyle Pitts because you can score a lot of points as a tight end against the Chiefs. We've obviously already seen Aaron Rodgers, Will Levis, guys like that. Matthew Stafford's low because he's got no one to catch the ball and he's got a tough matchup. Guys like Jones and Herbert, who we've considered in previous weeks, I wouldn't be touching this week. And Malik Willis, he had one good win, but I do think that's going to be a run-a-thon in Tennessee. Running backs, and some surprising names up here. Alvin Kamara, where did that come from? Did not see that coming going into the season. A whole lot of people talking about Kendre Miller getting involved. Of course, he's injured. Jamal Williams getting involved and getting some touches away. I mean, it hasn't happened. Alvin Kamara is the man there. He's still got a heap of juice left. I wouldn't say I'm surprised about that, but I am surprised that I'm ranking him number 1. I didn't see that coming. He takes on Philly, who all of a sudden is a very attackable running back matchup, especially through the air, but you can also attack them on the ground. So I do think Kamara has a good chance of another great week. I also contemplated having Jordan Mason as my number 1, which would be a little bit crazy, but I do feel like this is a great matchup against the Rams. They have conceded the 4th most points against running backs this season after being the 2nd best defense against running backs last year. It's amazing what happens when you have Aaron Donald and then you don't have Aaron Donald anymore. All of a sudden, it's a whole lot easier for teams to run on you. It's a whole lot harder for you to disrupt the pass as well. Bijan Robinson slots in 3rd. Traditionally, have been able to run on the Chiefs. It's been a bit harder this season, but I do still expect plenty of checkdowns to Robinson. Breece Hall, we saw, had another solid game as well. Saquon gets a tough matchup against New Orleans. They have a very good run defense. They have had for some time. They were top 6 as a run defense last season, and this season they've conceded the fewest points to opposing running backs. I still think Barkley has excellent touchdown upside, which is why I still ranked in my top 5, but I have tossed up putting Devon Achane ahead of him. Of course, Mostert being doubtful is part of the reason I'm considering moving Achane up. It is entirely possible to move him up, even potentially as high as 3, depending on how things go. But I think he'll probably settle at 5 or 6. He versus Barkley is interesting, but I'd be very surprised if you're making that choice. Jahmyr Gibbs and Jonathan Taylor are solid options. As I said, the Cardinals have been very easy to run on in the past, but not so much this season, which is why Gibbs is not higher. But I do still think there's some touchdown upside here. Zach Charbonnet is a surprise name in the top 10, but I always talk about handcuffs. If you read my Streamers and Stashes article, talk about half your bench should be handcuff running backs, essentially guys that just need an injury and suddenly they're a starter. And Zach Charbonnet has been high on my list all season, and he makes his way into the top 10. Taking on the Dolphins, who should struggle. This is a game that the Seahawks should win. The Dolphins have conceded the 6th most points to running backs so far this season. Again, plenty of noise in that data. It will settle down a little bit. I do think Charbonnet has a chance for a good game. Same thing with Josh Jacobs. He takes on Tennessee, who's near impossible to throw on at the moment. But Jacobs got like 31 touches last week. I do expect him to have another busy game in what should be a against Tennessee. It is possible Jordan Love's back, and that would, of course, quiet things down for Jacobs a little bit. But even if he's back, I do think he might be a little bit limited, and they might still want to get Jacobs heavily involved. No Marshall Lloyd definitely helps, but you will see a little bit of Emmanuel Wilson. I expect a lot of running in that game. Also in the game, Tony Pollard against the Packers. I just think that both teams are going to run the ball a heap. I think they're going to try to grind it out on the ground. Not the best run defenses for either team. So Pollard's another solid start, especially with Spears still a little injured, and therefore they can't really split the carries as they'd like to. Derrick Henry gets Dallas. He's away, which is usually bad for Derrick Henry, but they're the favorites, which is usually good for Derrick Henry. So not really sure exactly what to make of that. Ordinarily, you don't really want to start running backs against Dallas. They have been one of the better run defenses for this season. They've conceded 33.4 points per game to running backs, which is insane. So that's why I've got Henry relatively high, but I can't put him against those other guys who get more full usage, because it is possible that the Cowboys win this game or make it close enough that you don't get a lot of Henry usage. James Cook's, of course, another solid option. Guys that I don't particularly want to start, Kyren Williams against San Fran. I mean, it just feels like they're going to really struggle in that game. I can imagine a situation where he gets a lot of usage. And I think in PPR, he's probably a little bit higher, but it is so hard to start him after he struggled going, 2 yards a carry last week. That is not an easy run defense to play against. So not feeling good about that. Same thing with James Conner against Detroit. Now, they'll still find ways to get him the ball, which is why he's not ranked lower. But the Lions have had an excellent run defense for a while. They were the best in the league last season. This season, they are the second best. I mean, that is telling you something. There will still be checkdowns to Conner. He is one of their main weapons, but it is not as good a matchup as you want for him. It is entirely valid to start any of those three below him ahead of him if you wish. David Montgomery, also a guy with some touchdown upside and what I think could be a shootout against Arizona. Ramondre Stevenson, that should have been a really good matchup against the Jets, and he just didn't get used. They fell behind early, got a little bit banged up, and just decided not to use him. That's really disappointing for anyone who's a Stevenson manager, and for me, ranking him this high, but it is what it is. Now, some guys with good matchups that have some other issues. Well, Travis Etienne against Buffalo. The Bills, I mean, you attack them on the ground at the moment. It's just the way it is. Etienne's been splitting carries with either Tank Bigsby or, when Bigsby was out, Deonis Johnson. Clearly, they just want to give him less carries. That kind of happened towards the second half of last season. I thought it might stabilize a bit going into this season, but Etienne has once again been underused. This has got to be his get-right game. If they're going to stay in the game, we might see a lot of checkdowns to Etienne. We might see a lot of carries. I really hope that he can get good because he is a talented player and like to see him more involved. Zamir White takes on Carolina. This is a fantastic matchup. If the Raiders get even a sniff of a lead, I expect we see a lot of White. Could easily see him get over 20 carries. In PPR, he drops a little bit. In non-PPR, he's a great play this week. He has a lot of touchdown upside. Just run on the Panthers. That's what you got to do. I expect a lot of White, but he has a bit more risk than most starting running backs. Rashad White, another White with plenty of risk, gets another good running matchup. The Broncos were very good, very poor against running backs last season. It was very good to attack any running backs playing against the Broncos. This season, they're a little bit better, but they haven't exactly had the toughest of matchups running back-wise. I do think that White is a player that you can definitely start this week, even though Bucky Irving will continue to take touches. Zach Moss gets Washington. Now, you do traditionally attack Washington through the end, but you score a lot of points on them. And for that reason, Moss becomes a valid option as a starter there. Speaking of Washington, they take on Cincy, obviously, and Brian Robinson Jr. has been their main guy. I expect that to continue. I think both running backs are going to be involved, but Robinson is the main guy. DeAndre Swift's been disappointing to this point in time, but Indy is a fantastic matchup. In the past, last season, they were conceded the fourth most points to the running backs. Still conceding a lot this season, but not quite as many. I think Swift could bounce back. He's still getting the usage relative to the other players in his team, and Travis Homer is out, which means Roshan Johnson should be back as the receiving back, but it wouldn't surprise me at all. They don't really seem to love Johnson. There was talk in the preseason they might even release him. I do think it's possible that Swift gets some of those carries, which would help him as well. Some tough matchups in there. Aaron Jones, J.K. Dobbins, Cam Akers. Jones and Dobbins, they're just not really getting a number of touches that really would mean if they've got a bad matchup, you can rely on them. Not really exciting to start Dobbins, but he's had some fantastic matchups so far. That is not the case this week. It's very easy to run on guys like the Raiders and the Panthers, not so much on an excellent Steelers defense. The Steelers have conceded the fifth fewest points to running backs this season. And it's not like they've played against terrible running backs. It is going to be tough sledding for Dobbins. And Jones is just losing too many carries to Ty Chandler. I can't trust him, especially in a game that might be losing. He might get some checkdowns, but that's it. Harris against the Chargers should be a good matchup. I'm not actually sure that it is. I'm a little bit nervous about him, but he's still a solid option. Cam Akers appears to be the starter for Houston. A lot of people have been messaging me asking if you should start him. Well, if you don't have any of these guys above him, yes, you should. However, I am concerned that something, as Bobby on the Raspball podcast I did with him on your Friday night, he said that Cam Akers will have 6 fantastic carries, then fumble the ball twice and be off, and they won't use him anymore. And that's not out of the realms of possibility. He does do that sort of random rubbish. I do think Ogunbowale is going to be heavily involved on passing downs. I don't know that they're going to be able to easily move the ball. Cam Akers is a risky start, but still an okay start. Jerome Ford has still got ahead of Donta Foreman, despite the weird usage last season. Ford's still the better player. He's still the more talented player. I do think that he's a guy that you can viably start in a good matchup against the Giants. I just don't feel good about it. Neither do I feel good about Singletary on the other side, who obviously in that same game is an option. Don't really want to start him. Cleveland's just hard to play against in general, but it is the kind of game where the running backs could be involved. Chuba Hubbard has been disappointing this season. I still don't want to play him, but you can run against Vegas. The next 20 guys, I guess. Foreman, I obviously talked about already. Look, he's getting goal line carries, so there is upside there. I do think he could be solid. Javonte Williams, Angelo McLaughlin both appearing there. It seems like Williams has kind of taken over that lead role. He seems to be getting a lot of the passing downs. McLaughlin's still the change of pace guy, but Williams is the main guy. It has traditionally been really hard to run the ball on Tampa. Last season, they were considered the 3rd fewest points to running backs. This season, they've considered the 5th most. Part of that has been Vita Vea being banged up and he's out for this game, but also just because of a change in style as well, and the teams they've played against too. I do think Williams might have an okay game. A lot of people would have picked up the Chiefs guys. I don't really want to start Steele or P. Ryan. The Falcons have been just defensively very solid for some time now. Obviously, this is away against Atlanta as well. Atlanta last season conceded the 4th fewest points to running backs and the 5th fewest points to wide receivers. Generally, you do it using tight ends or not at all against the Falcons. And the same thing happening here. 5th fewest points against running backs this season and 8th fewest points against wide receivers. Very hard to take on that Falcons defense. Steele has that touchdown upside. Most people have P. Ryan ranked higher. I think Steele is going to be the goal line back, and he's the guy you want, where they're going to have to, well, they do like to run the ball around the goal line. It is possible to do the Jerick McKinnon thing where they use the passing back on the goal line and trust Mahomes. I'm not sure that'll happen this game, though. P. Ryan, I just don't think has been there long enough to really know the whole playbook and be able to be used effectively. He's still a viable option if you're desperate, and he'll go higher in PPR. Austin Eckler gets that Cincy matchup. I think he's an okay start, and he'll be a lot higher in PPR. Warren's coming back to health. Tyjae Spears, same deal, despite the good matchup. Gus Edwards gets a horrible matchup, and he's been ineffective when used. Dowdle started ahead of Zeke Elliott, but I don't want to start either of them against Baltimore. That's a horrible matchup. Justice Hill against Dallas. I mean, if they fall behind, he might get used, but it feels like more of a Henry game, I guess. Ty Chandler with that tough matchup. You can't start any of these guys lower than this. You might be tempted to start Madison against Carolina, but he got 5 touches for 1 yard and a touchdown, maybe 4 touches for 1 yard and a touchdown. Can't start him. Dario Ogunbowale in PPR is a little bit higher than this. He's a desperation option, I guess, as well. Let's talk about wide receivers. And Jamar Chase appears at number 1, which is a real shock, but they're taking on Washington. Such an easy matchup. Everyone blows up against Washington. Did you see Malik Neighbors last week? It's not like he was spectacular in week 1 and all of a sudden he's getting 12 from 14 for a touchdown and over 100 yards. Chase will do the same thing. He's going to have a fantastic week 1. I've got him ranked top, with CeeDee Lamb also having a solid matchup against Baltimore, who's really struggled to stop the pass this season. Traditionally, they've been pretty good at that. They've been one of the tougher defenses just in general. Last season, they were considered within the 10th fewest points against every position last season. This season, they've conceded the 6th most points against wide receivers and the 3rd most points against tight ends. So you can definitely suddenly throw the ball on Baltimore, and I expect that's going to start help Lamb and maybe Ferguson this season. Having said that, they might also get right at some point in time. Justin Jefferson, Amon-Ra St. Brown, you're obviously starting them. Rashee Rice, way higher than usual. I'm getting to the point where I really trust him. They're clearly using him as their number 1 guy. Same thing with Nico Collins. despite the fact they've got Diggs and Dell there, it is clear that Nico Collins is the guy you want. He gets an average matchup against Minnesota. Traditionally, you've really wanted to attack Minnesota through the air. A couple of years ago, they conceded the most points against wide receivers. Last season, it was the 6th most points against wide receivers. This season, they are mid-pack. Still someone you can attack, though. The Lions, you always attack through the air. Marvin Harrison Jr. should have a great game. Devonta Smith's obviously the new number 1 in Philly with A.J. Brown temporarily injured. It's not a great matchup against New Orleans, but if you're going to attack New Orleans somewhere, it is through the air. Brandon Ayuk's really the only option in San Fran, and LA will concede points. So I expect a lot of Jordan Mason, a lot of Brandon Ayuk through the air. I do think that could be a game where San Fran wins it easily enough, and there's only going to be 2 guys scoring fantasy points. It is also possible it's one of those games where all sorts of random guys pop up, and Chris Conley gets a touchdown, and I don't know, some other guy like Jacob Cowling ends up getting like 50 or 60 yards. Anything could happen here, but I do think it's probably Ayuk with a little bit of Jennings. Chris Olave, way higher than I've had him previously. Philly just so weak against wide receivers. They've got a number of rookies out wide. They've really struggled. Darius Slay is more of a big play Slay against him now. You can start Olave. You can't feel great about it, but you can start him. It is a great matchup. Garrett Wilson, obviously, we saw had a solid game on Thursday Night Football. Devontae Adams, you think that'd be a great matchup against Carolina. It's not. They're very good against the slot, but they're also solid against out wide. Not only because their players are solid, but also because you can just run on them all day. Like, you're always ahead against Carolina. They suck. Realistically, they've conceded the 2nd most points against running backs, but the 10th fewest points against wide receivers. They've conceded a bit against tight ends, but last season it was the same idea, but they conceded less against tight ends and even less against wide receivers. Couple of reds there. Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. Terrible matchup against Denver. Cannot be trusted. But you still got to start them anyway. Realistically, those guys have such high touchdown upside. They're going to score points. It's just not traditionally through the air. But I feel like you can still start Godwin and Evans and just feel a little bit awkward about it. Same thing with Tyreek Hill. He'll get the ball against Seattle, despite the fact you can run on Seattle and the Seattle cornerbacks are very strong. I still think that they're going to find ways to get Hill the ball. He's been used in a slot a lot recently. You can attack the slot against Seattle. I feel like he could still have a solid game despite the matchup. DJ Moore way higher than usual, but he's facing Indy. Considered, I think, the 5th most points against wide receivers this season. That's off the top of my head. It is the 5th most points against wide receivers. Gosh, I'm good. Malik Neighbors, on the other hand, takes on the Browns. You do not want to take on that secondary. Denzel Ward is so good. It's usually the wide receiver 2s and 3s that get it done against Cleveland, and the Giants don't have any. So not feeling great about Neighbors. He's going to be tracked all day by Ward, I expect. Zay Flowers, Jamison Williams, way higher than usual because he is looking really good this season. Gets an okay matchup against the Cardinals. George Pickens higher than most people, and you might reasonably say, if you've looked at the stats, hold up, the Chargers have conceded the 2nd fewest points against wide receivers this season, and you would be correct. But they've played against the Raiders, who just have Devontae Adams, and he wasn't very good that day, and the Panthers, who just weren't able to do anything at all. Traditionally, the Chargers have been an excellent wide receiver matchup. Last season, they considered the 3rd most points against wide receivers, and they haven't really changed much. It's not like their secondary is suddenly amazing. George Pickens was excellent last week against Denver with Patrick Surtain, who is the reason I've got Mike Evans lower, by the way. Not only did he have whatever his actual yardage was, he had a couple of big plays called back for random holding things that didn't affect his actual ability, and he drew a heap of flags as well. He's actually very good for Pittsburgh, just not so good for fantasy. Drake London against KC, tough matchup. Don't really particularly want to start him. Stephon Diggs has that touchdown upside, and then it gets really ugly real quickly. Rashid Shaheed at 24. I cannot believe how high I've ranked him. I don't feel good about this at all. He is really touchdown and bust. I don't want to start him here. Just everyone below him has either bad matchups or is just playing very badly. For example, Amari Cooper should have a great matchup. They're just not using him properly. He's such a talented player. He's been so good for so long. What are you doing, Deshaun Watson? You are just so annoying for fantasy. It is infuriating. Amari Cooper should be having a great season. I've got him in a lot of teams too, and I've ranked him high. Hate what's happening with him at the moment. This is really bizarre. Tank Dell's not getting enough touches. In fact, he's not getting enough snaps or routes. That's part of the issue there. That's why he's low. Michael Pittman Jr. is not being used by Anthony Richardson. I don't know if that's going to turn around, but he's still got the talent. he does get a tough matchup here against the Bears, and I do think Richardson improves. Jackson Smith-Njigba blew up last week, but he takes on Miami. I mean, it's not a terrible matchup. It's just not a great matchup. They've been one of the better teams against wide receivers this season, but I think that's mainly been because of how teams have played against them. I do think that they're probably more mid-pack. It's just hard to trust JSN in this game. I think it might be more of a Charbonnet game. T. Higgins is back. He gets that fantastic matchup, but is he going to play every snap? I think I would be keeping my ear to the ground. If there's any talk about him being limited as well, I will rank him kind of a bit lower than this. If there's no talk about that, I'll probably shift him up a bit. I think I could viably move him as high as 22 or 23 if I expect that he's going to be playing every snap. So I'll be making some movements of Higgins there. Whether you start him or not over the guys in his area depends on your risk profile and also what we hear about him heading into the game. It is hard because if I remember rightly, and I may not be remembering it, yes, he plays on Monday. So that makes things really hard. Having said that, I do expect him to play. Xavier Worthy is higher than he usually would be because this feels like the kind of game where there's going to be touchdowns and it could be by weird trick plays and big plays. That is how you can attack Atlanta. Plus, everyone below him has horrible matchups. Speaking of which, Jalen Waddle just doesn't seem to get used when they don't have Tua. So I don't want to use him either. Terry McLaurin, not being used by Jaden Daniels, or when he is, he gets like 6 passes for 18 yards, 6 catches for 18 yards. Absolutely ridiculous. That is not how he plays. But realistically, it's not what Washington's doing. Plus, Cincinnati's out wide cornerbacks have really improved. I don't want to start any of the Jaguars against the Bills. They are a really tough matchup for out wide receivers, the Bills. They have very much improved despite Teron Johnson's injury. Bottom 5 matchup for wide receivers. Don't trust Thomas. Don't trust Kirk, partly because of his usage. I never trust Gabe Davis. Don't want to start any of those guys. Calvin Ridley's hard to trust, but did have a good game last season. I just still think that's going to be a run-a-thon, but he might get some touchdowns. Demarcus Robinson is my favorite Ram. Technically, it's actually a good matchup. The 49ers are a team usually attack through the air, but it's hard to trust the Rams. I do think Robinson's probably the number one guy, but do we see Tyler Johnson have a big game like in week 1? Do we see Tutu Atwell run like 10 routes and get 4 catches? Very possible. Is Jordan Whittington suddenly great through the slot because that is how you can attack the 49ers? Maybe. For that reason, I don't feel great about Robinson, but he's still a viable streaming option. Deontay Johnson, I think, is probably going to be the number one. With Andy Dalton now quarterback for the Panthers, I feel a little bit better about their pass catches, but Johnson is the only one I'd even consider starting. Khalil Shakir has moved up because he's just clearly getting used. He's not running the routes, but they're using him. It's kind of like with Jaden Reed and Christian Kirk last season. They weren't running enough routes, but they were the target when they were on the field, and that's what's been happening with Shakir. I do think that might even out a little bit. I still believe in Keon Coleman's talent. That's why I've got him ranked at 49. It is technically a really good out-wide matchup. They've got guys like Monteric Brown starting out-wide cornerback. I mean, that is a great matchup for Coleman, but they just haven't used him, so I don't trust him until I see it. Ladd McConkey and also Quinton Johnston get tough matchups against Pittsburgh. Johnston's moving up for me. He has looked really good. He was a dynasty stash for me going into the season. Happy with how that's panned out. I also think Ladd McConkey is going to get better in better matchups. Couple of deeper guys you can probably start. Brandon Cooks gets a solid matchup, but I don't really trust him. Rome Odunze against the Colts, going to be the wide receiver too, with probably no Keenan Allen. Greg Dortch is more of a deep streamer option. He takes on Detroit, who is very weak against slot receivers. That is where Dortch plays for the Cardinals. He has these blow-up games for the Cardinals where he gets like 10 to 12 targets and all of a sudden has like 80 yards. Very possible that happens in this game. And Juwan Jennings takes on the Rams. I just don't trust him because of the type of player he is and how he typically plays. Tight ends, before I lose my voice. Trey McBride, you're definitely starting. Brock Bowers against Carolina, that is how you can attack Carolina. And Brock Bowers had a great start to the season. I ranked him number 2 on my dynasty tight end rankings going into the season, like immediately after the draft. Loved Brock Bowers. People laughed at me, which is fine. I'm used to people laughing at me. I like to tell jokes. In this case, I wasn't hoping for laughter as a response, but who's laughing now? Maybe still you. I don't know. Travis Kelce against Atlanta. That's a solid tight end matchup. Sam Laporta gets a tough matchup against Arizona. They've been good against tight ends for a while, but he's still got such good touchdown upside on what should be a high-scoring game, although he has disappointed to this point. Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely, who's ranked at 11. against Dallas. It's a real awkward situation. I don't know what to do with them, but Likely ran way fewer routes last week. Is it going to be a situation when Likely just has random blow-up games and the rest of the time he's average and Andrews is actually the number one? I don't know. But if you wasted a whole heap of fab on Likely, it's not looking great right now. Kyle Pitts gets the Chiefs. They've been a great matchup against tight ends so far this season. Is that going to continue? Well, I don't know, because last season they were the third worst matchup against tight ends. This season, they are the best matchup. They've considered 23.1 half PPR points against tight ends so far this season, which is incredibly weird. So I don't exactly know what's going on there, but it makes me feel a bit better about Pitts. I've moved him up slightly despite his poor start to the season. I say poor start. He was like the tight end 3 in week 3, but he had like 3 catches and a touchdown for like 40-something yards. Dalton Kincaid just remains a solid option. His usage is good. They're not passing the ball a lot because they haven't needed to, and I don't think they will have to this week. Jake Ferguson gets an interesting matchup against Baltimore. They have been able to be attacked by tight ends so far this season. I don't know if that happens again in this game or if that's just noise. We will find out. Dallas Goedert. I mean, there's just so few good tight end options at the moment that Goedert kind of naturally rises. Same thing with Hunter Henry. That was technically a good tight end matchup against the Jets, but it didn't work out. He dropped a few catches. They gave catches to Austin Hooper instead of Henry. I don't know what was going on that game. They fell behind early and they just stopped using the starters. That was an absolute mess. Other interesting guys. I mean, 3 streamers that we thought might be useful and have bad matchups. Mike Gesicki, Zach Ertz, and Colby Parkinson. Ertz not the worst matchup, but he's someone that a lot of people have been talking about picking up. I don't really want to start him this week. Mike Gesicki has been running so many routes, like 30-odd routes a game, which is solid, but he's been one of the main options when running them. The problem is that T. Higgins is back, and that might really affect Gesicki, so I don't love him this week. I'd have plenty of people ahead of him, but no one has a good matchup or situation. Colby Parkinson can't be trusted against the 49ers. Pat Freiermuth isn't running enough routes. I think that's going to be an ugly run game again. Taysom Hill isn't even healthy. He's got a chest injury, I think, although they do often use him in close games, and this could be one of those. Greg Dulcich is improving. He's finally starting to go past Adam Troutman, and we haven't seen any of Lucas Krull. So Cecil Lamming actually got one wrong. He's an excellent Broncos beat reporter who's usually spot on, not so much this preseason with the tight ends. Dulcich gets a good matchup. He's a viable option. Dalton Schultz had like 6 targets for like 3 catches or something this season. He's not really a part of that offense anymore, which is weird. They gave him a lot of money, and then they brought in Cade Stover in the draft, and they've still got Brevin Jordan. It's real weird, although I think Jordan's injured. Realistically, I can't trust Schultz until I see it happen. I think probably a wide receiver injury will really spark Schultz, but for now, he's someone you can't use. Brendan Strange, I've got 19. I know that Bobby from Rasbel has him way higher. I do think he could have a good game, but against Buffalo, I think it's going to be hard for them to do much at all. It is a solid matchup for tight ends. He is kind of like a low-end streamer that you can take a risk with, but it is a big risk. Same thing with Janu Smith. We saw him have a blow-up game last week. Seattle, I mean, they're going to have to throw the ball. Skylar Thompson, who knows what he's going to do, whether last week was just a weird one. But we have seen the Seahawks concede the 6th most points to tight end, so it is possible that Smith will succeed that way. Of course, the previous season, they were just mid-table, so I haven't got it as a green matchup because I think that was just a fluke through 2 weeks. Noah Fant, I've been talking about him for a while. He's getting the routes, but they've got 3 good wide receivers ahead of him, so it's just not working out. Cole Kmet moved back ahead of Gerald Everett last week and was certainly getting better, more productive, more useful targets. But it's still a committee, so you can't really trust him. Kate Otten gets a good matchup, but he just never gets used. Johnny Munt, Hayden Hurst, blah. Tyler Conklin had a terrible matchup and somehow made it work. So who knows? I don't want to start any of the rest of these guys. Juwan Johnson's running like 10 routes. That's amazing for a guy who's like a top 10 tight end 2 seasons ago. He's just plain not getting used behind Fabian Moreau. They're running the ball so much. It's a real committee. Okonkwo in a committee. Akins just didn't get used after being used a heap in week 1. It's so weird. I want to put him higher. He should have been used like Njoku. He's got that same talent. He just wasn't. Tucker Kraft gets a terrible matchup. Can't trust him, especially because they're using Musgrave in a lot of really good passing situations, even though Kraft's getting most of the snaps. And that's all we've got. Woo! I hope that helped with your start-sit decisions. If you want, please feel free to ask any questions in the comments below. You can also hit me up on Instagram, and I might even put the links up there. On Instagram, at the Fantasy First Down. On Twitter, at Fantasy First Down with no O. I will answer all your questions on there. Our rankings are at ffdfantasyfootball.com. Would be great if you'd like and subscribe on YouTube. That really helps us out. Plus, my articles are at football.rasball.com. Speaking of Rasball, in the 2 hours before the game, the Rasball Fantasy YouTube channel does a start-sit show. I will be on there for the first hour. So if you want any questions actually answered like this verbally, you can get my opinion plus the opinion of 4 other guys who are very knowledgeable experts as well. In fact, Rasball had 4 guys in the top 30 rankers in last week's rankings, which is very good because each week on Fantasy Pros, there are like 250 people ranking. So that's pretty darn accurate. So look, I hope this has helped you out. I look forward to catching up with you next week, but please hit me up if you've got any start sit questions and let's enjoy some football.